Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time. Nor should it mean perfect, for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So, I've been struggling for the last couple of episodes with kind of the direction, to be honest with you, of where the podcast is going and what I want to do with it going forward. I know there's endless, kinds of topics that I can focus on, but I keep coming back to this idea of use of force domestically in the US, and this has come to the forefront in this new literature out of the Biden White House on handling domestic extremism, domestic terrorism. And for me, this definitely strikes me as something that ties back to issues of race and ethnicity and issues of police violence and protesting and just a lot of really sort of sensitive, hot button, quote unquote, quote, cultural issues. But I thought I'd take a second stab at at some issues of race as a white cisgender man, of course. And so before I do that, I want to make a point of directing you guys to some people of color that are, that have some great, thoughtful takes on these issues. Primarily, the two that I'd like to highlight are the Pod Save the People podcast from Crooked Media, which I've been aware of for a decent stretch, and Fred Hampton Leftists, which is a bit newer for me, but one that I think really has some fresh is a good word for them, but it's also their ideas are rooted in history by way of their main namesake, Fred Hampton. So I'd say generally Pod Save the People is a little bit to my right, and Fred Hampton Leftists are probably to my left, generally speaking, but they both have some great perspectives on all the kind of hot button issues you can think of. So please do check them out and take, a white man's perspective with a grain of salt, if you will, on these issues. So I wanted to focus on what's, the so-called monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force, which is sometimes shortened to the monopoly on violence, which is basically about the degree to which the state and the police have this kind of legal authority to use force that no one else really has. And of course, we can talk about this frame this in light of the Second Amendment, which is, I would say, it doesn't contravene this idea of the legitimate use of force, because generally the Second Amendment is about defense of life, liberty, and property. I think it's the proper set of things that you can legitimately use force for or in defense of as a private citizen that doesn't run afoul of this monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force. But I'm struggling with how this kind of all comes together, and so this will be a little bit more of a stream of consciousness video, if you will. So bear with me, if you will. So this new literature, as I said, from the Biden White House talks about domestic violent extremists, and is meant to be sort of a response to the January 6th insurrection, riots, whatever you want to call it. And as many have been saying on the left, this harkens back to the Patriot Act, and the sort of overreach for domestic surveillance, and the fact that, in essence, a lot of the stuff that we'd be trying to combat with this domestic violent extremist literature is already covered by current law. And so the push from the left has been, do we really need more initiatives in law enforcement, more potential authority for law enforcement in order to combat this stuff. And I would argue that there's some strong indicators out of the literature from the White House that suggest that this is exactly the problem, that we are creating more authority that isn't needed and that will likely be abused in the way that the Patriot Act was abused. So, in particular, the literature talks about how this is about violent extremists, right? And it defines domestic violent extremists as US-based actors who conduct or threaten activities that are dangerous to human life in violation of the criminal laws of the United States or any state, meaning any of the 50 states. And what is probably most concerning, and Kyle Kalinske has pointed this out of Secular Talk, is, and done it very eloquently, I would argue, is that part of the problem is the information sharing that is sort of prescribed by this directive, the information sharing being between the US government and the quote unquote technology sector with the aim to eliminate terrorist content online while safeguarding the freedom of online expression. And so obviously what this means is, if not directly surveillance, some degree of, a new type of way of looking into things that might be warrantless, the way, the Patriot Act was, and that sort of thing. So despite the fact that, obviously the idea is that, when you talk about violence, okay, yeah, well, obviously we want to prevent violence, but if the way to go about combating that violence involves sharing information, that could run afoul of civil liberties the way that the Patriot Act does. And, the thing about the Patriot Act, just to kind of revisit that, is that it redefined the type of conduct that the government can investigate when it is investigating terrorism. And so the ACLU published some work talking about how certain kinds of civil disobedience, like with the Vieques island protests in Puerto Rico, that attempted to disrupt bombing exercises there. I think it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. Basically what they said is that domestic terrorism as defined was about things that are dangerous to human life, right? So which I mentioned which is included in this new directive, the same kind of rhetoric, the same kind of lingo. And so the problem with this is that this talks about kind of threats, right, rather than outright violence, whereas threats can be a little bit more nebulous and difficult to define what counts as a threat, whereas violence is at least a little bit more directly definable. And so what the ACLU recommended in the case of the Patriot Act was that it should specify acts which, quote unquote, cause serious physical injury or death, rather than all acts that are dangerous to human life. And so you see, history is repeating itself to at least a small extent here, in terms of, the rhetoric that we're using is the same sort of, like I said, lingo that the government is using. And, again, to kind of deepen the discussion, this can be used not just for combating white supremacy and sort of violence derived from disinformation or conspiracy theories. But with this, it opens the door to attacking leftist sort of anti-authority, anti-capitalist was actually a particular part of the language, that kind of rhetoric. And so as I said, when you're talking about threats, deeming a threat can be an inherent political act. So when a political entity, uses that kind of language, there's a signal there that perhaps that power could be abused. So I thought that was sort of a very important first thing to look at when we talk about the legitimate use of force by the state, the monopoly, I should say, of the legitimate use of physical force. And this, I think, goes to things like police brutality, right? Where, the legal rhetoric is sufficiently broad that it allows for things that are not so good. So we talked obviously just now about, the way it can be used to fight leftist rhetoric, but also it can be used for racist purposes. to pick out people unfairly as targets for police violence. And so I saw this as kind of a lens into the racism, cultural issue debate that's occurring broadly in society, but also kind of within the left as well. There's sort of a critique made by some parts of probably the more moderate parts of political discourse about people being class essentialist or reductivist, whereas kind of a right-wing critique might be kind of a race reductivist critique that, oh, you're making this all about class, or oh, you're making this all about race. And I've been thinking about this a lot because it strikes me as like an argument that only actually makes sense against a very small percentage of the discourse, if you will. Most people have a more nuanced view than saying, oh, it's all about race, or oh, it's all about class. Most people that you actually engage with that are serious thinkers on this recognize that this is a intertwined set of issues, that things are rarely just class or just race issues. And it sounds obvious to say it out loud, but obviously a lot of the things that hold certain populations down put them into a class paradigm, right? So inequality between the quote unquote races in the U.S., which, by the way, I should have said at the outset, that race is obviously a social construct, and so we talk about race versus ethnicity and these kind of terms, but the sort of the way it boils down, if I were to be a race reductivist for just a moment, if you will, is judging people on the basis of physical characteristics, and this obviously can be applied to genderqueer or transgender or intersex or what have you folks as well. So now we're not just talking about race and ethnicity and class, we're also talking about gender and sexuality and these sorts of things. But because these can all be used by bad faith actors to kind of reduce the argument to like, this is just a cultural issue. And this is especially done by the right, but is often also done, I'd argue, by the center of the country. And so I just wanted to, kind of say digress a little bit to say we need to move past this critique of like, oh, you're being a class essentialist, or oh, you're being race reductive. Like, this isn't a thing that really happens in most critique, at least most serious critique. And as someone who's active online and engages a lot with the online left and with critiques of the online left, I find that this is an easy kind of talking point. In the same way that people talk about socialism and make critiques of, oh, well, you're just being a socialist or a Marxist, and that should automatically disqualify anything that you have to say. It's easy to label people to serve your argument. But one of the things that's become increasingly clear to me is that you have to put the kibosh on that kind of dialogue immediately. And the easiest way to do that is to ask people to define their terms, right? What are you talking about? Are you how would you define socialism? Can you actually define socialism? Because what I think you'll often find is that people often don't have good definitions for their terms. They're just using them. They're just weaponizing those terms without a real understanding of what they're talking about, because corporate media has fed them Fox News or in some cases more quote unquote left, or at least centrist corporate media. CNN is guilty of making these sort of reductivist arguments, and so I'm increasingly finding we need to take those head on and say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Let's get into the, and by the way, this is probably the linguist in me talking, that defining terms I think is really important for getting at some of these problems. So we've talked about this, domestic violence, violent extremist, rhetoric from our government, and we've talked about a little bit about police brutality, right? And these could each be videos in their own right, but I'm grouping them together because, like I said, this is something that's kind of brewing in my head that I wanted to just kind of air out. And that's the whole idea behind this podcast, is thinking through decent ideas, right, that aren't perfect, that aren't settled, but give us an opportunity to kind of start thinking, how can we look at this differently, right? And so I guess the last piece that I wanted to, or the last sort of framing for this that I wanted to get into, is the discourse around guns and gun control. And by the way, the reason that I, plugged those two groups, the Pod Save the People and the Fred Hampton leftists, is because generally it strikes me as though they have pretty different takes on the issue of guns in particular. And this is a broad kind of characterization, so I apologize if I'm missing some nuance here, and I'd love to engage more online with folks on this, but broadly, Fred Hampton leftists have taken a more libertarian, let's say generically libertarian stance on this about, we can't, the Second Amendment is more inalienable a right, unalterable a right for some of these folks. And, I think a lot of this, what we're talking about today, gets to kind of my views on force, right? So we were talking about monopoly on the use of force. I am generally a pacifist, and I've explained in previous episodes some of my caveats to that in terms of international relations and my sort of, at least what's perceived probably by many as heterodox thoughts on this, on the use of force abroad. In the domestic arena, I would say generally I'm an advocate for gun reform and gun control, and expansion of background checks, bans on assault rifles, assault weapons, tactical weapons, large capacity magazines, these kinds of things. I think it all kind of gets to, again, this whole idea on the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force, because the Second Amendment kind of exposes a bit of a conundrum with the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment essentially, as I alluded to a little bit, authorizes the defensive, at least, use of physical force. And I think that that's generally where I'd kind of come down on the boundary between these two things, is that the Second Amendment is meant as defense, and meant to be used for defense of life, liberty, and property. And when it comes to limiting that right, and limiting what kinds of firearms should be allowed to have, in my view, this is about at the least limiting mass shootings of the kind and frequency that we've been seeing so far this year. The Second Amendment, as with most rights, I believe, is not without limit. Whereas, by the way, the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, the monopoly on violence by the state, by the police, is meant to be for the purpose of preserving our rights, right? Preserving our lives and liberties in the event of crimes, right? So you can't generally take the law into your own hands, and you can't engage in vigilantism. That's frowned upon, shall we say, by our legal system, unless you're Batman, and then go nuts, I guess. Big comic book fan, if you haven't gathered that so far from the podcast. But that's kind of where I see the boundary. But it is, it gets sort of, let's to bring it sort of full circle a little bit. It gets to this question of, is the monopoly on violence by the state being abused, right? We have to be able to rein those things in through the way our government legislates, and through the way both our federal government legislates and our states legislate as well. And, we talked briefly about the state of the police, and it hopefully goes without saying for most of my very small audience that, the police was an inherently white supremacist institution, both before and following the Civil War, especially in the South. They were established as slave patrols in the 1700s in much of the country, and there's a direct linkage to be drawn from that past to our present, in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of drug crimes, and criminalization of drug use, and so many things of that nature. And I hope I'll have an opportunity to come back to some of that. But we need to find the balance, to put it in a facile manner, if I might. And I guess what this kind of all ties into, and I talked about this in a previous episode, is some things I talked about in a previous episode was about how we can use voting rights and rethinking hate speech to help kind of level the playing field in terms of these inequities, race or class or both, in our country. It gets to kind of my ideology, which I've sort of tried to kind of piece together, start to build the foundation for as a left libertarian, right? The definition for me, and as with many of these political ideology terms, there's so many different kinds. Being a left libertarian for me means balancing freedom, security, and equity in equal measure. And equity is, a difficult term to define, so I'll give you my definition, which the simple one is, being fair and impartial. And being fair doesn't necessarily mean giving everyone the same thing, right? Or even the same opportunity. What it does mean, at least to me, is I take it from the Guilford Covenant, which was signed in Connecticut in 1639. Basically, according to every man's ability, and as need shall require, which was adapted or reframed by Marx, actually. And while I have some differences of opinion with Marx, I put it this way because the idea is not everyone wants the same things, not everyone needs the same things. But what it does mean is that we as a society have to determine at some level what it is that people need. And what it is that individuals need. And because, in my view, if we were to apply this concept of balancing freedom, security, and equity, we could get to a point where we'd level the playing field significantly for people of different phenotypes, to take the biological terminology around race and gender. We can get to some measure of equity. And, if you balance that with both freedom and security, which in a lot of cases come into conflict, the way I generally see it is that my freedom ends where yours begins. And similarly, my security shouldn't impose upon your security unnecessarily. And so that's the ideology that I ascribe to and have, attempted to, like I said, lay the groundwork for so far. And then the other piece is, something I've talked about a decent bit, which is the sort of one of the cornerstones of my political advocacy, which is federal decentralization, that I believe that we should decentralize the U.S. into 5 more culturally and ideologically aligned sub-federations, because I believe that would change the game on policy making and facilitate renewed political engagement in the direction of real progress. And that does mean letting people go their own way, right? And some might choose to go backwards. And I think we need to allow for that kind of laboratory of democracy, if you will. But I believe, combining left libertarianism with this idea of decentralization of the federation would start to get us at dealing with, in a more sensible way than I think, to be honest, our federal government is right now, and our police are at the state level right now, allow us to get to a better balance of freedom, security, and equity. And by the way, I think several of those 5 regions would look to demilitarize the police and would look to better fund social workers and other intervention and de-escalation methods than policing as we have it today. At the end of the day, the kind of hot take I'd give on, the legitimate use of physical force granted to the police by the state is that because they have this monopoly, it's an indicator that that monopoly is meant to be used as infrequently as possible. That use of forces shouldn't be abused, and that we do seem to be on a poor trajectory, let's put it that way, in the direction of, not to be alarmist, but authoritarianism, of a greater police state, despite the fact that we have, someone with a D after their name in the White House rather than an R. And I always like to use this Battlestar Galactica quote if my nerdiness wasn't showing enough this episode. And it goes like this: "There's a reason you separate the military and the police. One fights the enemies of the state, the other serves and protects the people. When the military becomes both, then the enemies of the state tend to become the people." So I wanted to, like I said, kind of lay some bricks, I guess, together, and just talking out loud about what I'm seeing with this approach toward domestic extremism, with police violence, with the stagnation on gun control legislation, and at some point I'd love to talk more about gun control and my respectful critique, hopefully, of folks like the Fred Hampton leftists, that we might create an escalation that wasn't necessary, that didn't need to happen, by taking such a libertarian approach, such a classical libertarian approach, if you will, to guns. But generally, my hope is that, as with most of these episodes, it's the trigger for a discussion, right? And so thank you for permitting me to get into that a little bit today. And so hopefully this wasn't too rambling an episode today, but I think I'll leave it at that for today. So I'm available to chat on Twitter at DecentFedPROJ, or please feel free to engage in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. For those who don't know, depending on how you're taking this in, the podcast is available on YouTube by searching Decent Federalism Project, and on most audio podcast platforms by searching Decent Ideas Podcast. We'd also be deeply honored if you shared this podcast with a friend on social media. So next time, we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue that deserves a new set of eyes. I'll keep you guessing on what's coming next. Until then, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well, and thanks so much for listening.